Welcome to Elemi Design Tech Tuts. My name is Carlos Cucalon, and today we're going to talk about baseline grids and why you should consider using them on your web projects. Even though baseline grids are somewhat new to web, baseline grids have been used by print designers for a very long time. So what's a baseline grid? A baseline grid is a horizontal grid system that exactly aligns the baseline of all the text on a page, regardless of size or style. You may be asking yourself, why does that matter? Just like in music, baseline grid helps create a smooth rhythm in the typography within a design. This exercise, even though it's not difficult, requires some knowledge of CSS and HTML. If I were to rate this application, I would say that it's on a 2 on a scale from 1 to 5 in complexity. I wanted to make a quick stop in the video and talk about the difference between using pixels, EMs, and REMs. Now, while EM is relative to the font size of its direct or nearest parent, REM is only relative to the HTML or root font size. So for example, I'm declaring that the font size is 24 pixels. That is my root font size. For my paragraphs, what I'm saying is that here is that 1 EM is the same thing as 1 times 24 pixels. So in other words, the paragraph tag is 24 pixels. However, for example, let's say that I'm using 1.5 EM, and that in this case, the paragraph tag would actually be 36 pixels tall, correct? So what if I were to say the quotes, if I say 1 EM, it takes as the parent, which is the paragraph tag, if you can see it here, for example. So you have a paragraph tag and then you have the quote. Now that quote here is going to take its parent if I'm using EM, and it's going to give me the same value. So if we look for a quote in here, something very simple to look at, okay? So if we look at this quote is the same size as the as its parent, which is 36 pixels. Now if I were to change that, and instead of saying 1 EM, I want to change it to 1 REM, you'll see now that my font size for my quotes has reverted back to 24 pixels, which is its parent. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this exercise, that there is a difference between using EM and REM. And the best way to say it is that EM is relative to the font size of its direct or nearest parent, which in this case was the quote within a paragraph, but REM is only relative to the HTML or root font size, which in our case was 24 pixels declared on the top of the style. To create this exercise, we're going to seek the help of 2 websites to make it easier on ourselves. Keep in mind that these are websites that will help us only, but it can be done without them. The first website is Modular Scale. A modular scale is a sequence of numbers that relate to one another in a meaningful way. Using the golden ratio, for example, we can produce values for a modular scale by multiplying by 1.618 to arrive at the next highest number, or dividing by 1.618 to arrive at the next number down. This website helps you select numbers for your typography that will relate beautifully with each other. In our case, we're going to be using the golden ratio. If you don't know what that is or haven't seen it, you should definitely check it out. I believe it will change your perspective as a designer. The second website we're going to use is basehold.it or basehold it. These external CSS calls help create easily embeddable baseline grids that can be easily adjusted by changing the number at the end of the URL. Just like what I'm doing right now. On a quick note, as a good rule of thumb for readability, you want your columns of text to be between 50 to 60 characters, but no more than 70. The narrower the column, the less characters you want. Wider columns can accommodate more letters, but you need to make adjustments to the size and leading. Also, all the links and resources can be found below the video and/or in my blog described below. The resources will include a link to both Modular Scale and base holded, as well as the base and final HTML and CSS for this project. For our example, we're going to set 5 media queries in which we're going to be calling base holded and requesting grids for 40, 36, 32, 28, and 24 pixels. All these variables are separated by 4 pixels because the smaller the difference will create the most smooth transition from one media query to the next. Let's declare all the elements that we're going to be editing for this example. Body, H1, H2, our paragraph or P element, and of course our quotes. And to make it more recognizable, we're going to add some properties that won't affect this when setting up the baseline grid, such as the color, font weight, alignment, etc. Now, one quick little tip. As for the quotes, if you look at the text itself, you will see that the text has already quotes in it. So when we're surrounded with the quotes tags, it adds extra quotes around the text. What we're going to do is add these quotes attribute and set up the value as single quote, space, single quote. What that's going to do is remove the markup that gets added automatically by the quote tag to make it look a little bit nicer. We're also going to add the global selector, the asterisk, and zero out our padding and margins. That would actually change the elements, all the elements on the page. So everything as far as padding and margins will be 0. Now that the formatting has been set up, we're going to add font sizes to each element, H1, H2, and paragraph, using the modular scale website to determine the size. We're going to start with 1 EM for the paragraph, .618 EM for the H2, and 2.618 EM for H1. We did not declare the font size for the quotes, as that tag, semantically speaking, is always placed inside a paragraph or header tag. If you're not doing it that way, then I would suggest updating that as well. As you can see on our CSS file, I have set up the same media queries we used to call our baseline grids from base holded. Here's where the fun begins, and where you can see how simple it is to set up baseline grids for a website. We're going to add the HTML and body elements as our selectors and declare the font size to 40 to our widest screen resolution. And to make it look a little bit nicer and to stay within the no more than 70 characters wide rule, we're also going to declare the div container and set up a width of no more than 70%. To add something extra, let's also add a left and right padding of 2 EM, which, if you recall properly based on our font size, it will be 80 pixels wide. And to center the div, we're going to add a margin of 0 auto, which will make sure that there's no margin on top and bottom, but also take the space from the left and the right and split it in half equally, which will cause our div container to be centered on the page. Taking a look at the document, it doesn't look half bad. However, it just seems like everything is running together, and of course the text is not aligned to the baseline grid. Starting from the header 1, we're going to add a line height of 3 REM. Why do you think we're setting up REM versus EM? I'll give you a moment to pause the video and get back to me. Are you ready? Well, the reason why we did that is because if we use EM rather than REM, it would have used the value for the H1 font size, which in this case, if we multiply 2.618 to 40, it will be equal to 104.72 pixels instead of 80 pixels. For margins and line heights, we're going to use REM instead of EM for the same reason, just to make it easier on us when doing calculations. But if I feel like we can still define it a little bit better. let's add margins to the H1. We're going to add a margin of 40 pixels defined by 1 rem to the top and 80 pixels defined as 2 rem on the bottom, and leave both left and right margins as auto. Let's refresh and take a look at how it looks now. Much better. Now, you may be asking yourself why the baseline of the font doesn't align to the baseline grid itself. And that's because the line height doesn't really align elements to the bottom of the line height, but to its middle. By inspecting the element, we can see that the whole H1 element within the font size, line height, and margins align perfectly to the baseline grid. This is common and should not worry you when creating your own baseline grid. Now that we're done with the H1, let's move on to the H2. For the H2, since the font size is 1.618 em, let's go ahead and set up the line height as 2 rem. And the margins are going to be the same as the H1 just to keep things consistent and because I really like the look. Let's take a look. And the H2 looks great. If we pay attention though, our paragraphs are still out of whack from our baseline grid. Let's fix that. Setting up our paragraphs, let's take our line height as 1 rem, and the margins are going to follow the same standard as our header elements. Now that we refresh the page, we can see that all our elements are working properly and aligning to the baseline grid. You may be asking yourself, well, Carlos, you have made the margins and line height the same throughout, so it should be simple. And my answer is, yeah. However, if you want to change the line height or use other variables instead of a 1 for the paragraph line height, you may want to change it to, for example, 1.5 rem. When you refresh the page, it looks like it's messed up for now, but in reality it's not. One thing you can do is head to the HTML file and change the call for that media query and have the size of the base-holded CSS to 20. Once you refresh the page, you will see that the baseline grid has changed and the text itself is aligned better to the baseline grid. And again, we're going to inspect the element, and this will help us confirm that the font is in its right place. However, the lines seem a little bit off and too spaced out. So what we're going to do is have it again on the base-holded CSS to 10 and change our line height to 1.25 rem instead. I think that looks a lot better. You may be asking yourself, why are you dividing it in half and then dividing it in half again? And that's because we're now using a quarter of the 1.25 rem declaration of our base font size, which is 40. So 40 divided by 4 is 10. You can get a lot fancier on your measurements for line height and margins. However, I leave it to you to experiment on it. Since that's going to be our final size, let's set up the other base-holded calls to correspond to a quarter value. So 36 divided by 4 is 9, 32 divided by 4 is 8, 28 divided by 4 is 7, and lucky me, 24 divided by 4 is 6. Once we have the baseline grids and font size, line heights, and margins set up, it's really a piece of cake to make the rest of the page responsive and to scale properly. What we're going to do is copy our selectors and attributes from the 80.01 em media query and paste it on the other media queries. Once that's done, let's change the font size to their corresponding font size, and we're going to increase the container width by 5% for each successive query. And for the last two, we're going to remove the padding altogether, just so that there's a bit more space since we're using a larger font size for this exercise. Save the document and refresh the page, and voila! Our baseline grid works like a charm. One more edit. If you notice the fonts throughout this page, it has been serif. However, it's a bit hard to read serif, especially on a mobile device. So what we're going to do is change our font family declaration for the paragraph tag to sans serif. And now we refresh, and the baseline grid is set up and works beautifully. I hope that at the end of this exercise, you'll find the value of setting up baseline grids for your projects, understand the beauty and simplicity of baseline grids, and be encouraged to go and try it on your own. Feel free to download the resources provided and practice. As always, we will appreciate you subscribing to our channel, and if you have questions, feel free to ask them on the comments below. One question for you: how would you use baseline grids on your next project? Thank you for watching Alignment Design Tech Tuts. Until next time.